Welcome to the Into the Old Forest, the beginning chapters of the Fellowship of the Ring. Today we look at the first 7 chapters of the Fellowship of the Ring, the first book in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay my respect to elders past and present, and I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. J.R.R. Tolkien's unique imagination, combined with his knowledge of language and narrative, helped him create the world of Middle-earth and provide us with one of the most well-known and loved books of the 20th century. The book was made into a famous trilogy from about 1999 to 2001 from memory, directed of course Peter Jackson, and the film was of enormous success worldwide. What I'm hoping to do in this first instalment is to introduce the Fellowship of the Ring. We'll look at the first 7 chapters. I'm going to use mainly the narrative of the Lord of the Rings itself, but also access to film and talk about different aspects of how Tolkien introduced ideas into the narrative. A kind of fusion of ingredients, if you like. As Bill the Troll said in the movie version of The Hobbit, I'm hoping that this fusion will be beautifully balanced. The story of the Lord of the Rings begins with several events that take place in The Hobbit. While wandering deep in the Lost Cave, Bilbo Baggins, the Hobbit, one of a small kindly race about half the size of men, stumbles upon a ring and takes it back with him to the Shire, the part of Middle-earth that is the Hobbit's home. All Bilbo knows of the ring is that wearing it causes him to become invisible. He is unaware that it is the One Ring and is therefore oblivious to its significance and the fact that Sauron, the Dark Lord, has been searching for it. Get stuck into it. We begin with chapters 1 to 5 of the Shire. A long-expected party, the shadow of the past, 3 as company, a shortcut to mushrooms, and a conspiracy unmasked. So, a long-expected party. It details Bilbo Baggins' party. So Bilbo is the one who found the ring. He is now much older than when he went on his adventures in The Hobbit. And Gandalf the Wizard also comes along to this party. Bilbo is intending to leave the Shire and leave the ring to his nephew, Frodo. Turning 111 is a cause for celebration, but also of conjecture in the Shire. Bilbo enjoys his notoriety in the Shire after returning from his adventures in The Hobbit. But what is causing his long life? Gandalf the Wizard suspects that the magical ring holds deep powers. Finally, Bilbo declares that he is leaving. He slips on his magic ring, turning himself invisible. The hobbits, alarmed and annoyed, finish the big party and leave. Gandalf promises to look after Frodo and suggests that Bilbo leave the magic ring behind. Bilbo becomes defensive and angry at Gandalf's insistence. At last, Bilbo trusts Gandalf's judgment and releases the ring before leaving with 3 dwarves down the road while singing a song. Gandalf leaves Frodo with another warning about the ring, the reasons for which he cannot give, but states that his suspicions are aroused. He bids Frodo farewell and departs, not to be seen in Hobbiton again for some years. The shadow of the past is chapter 2. Several years pass. There are rumours of trouble in the outside world. Frodo has inherited Bag End from Bilbo. One night, Gandalf reappears at Bag End after several years of absence and is welcomed in by Frodo. The two have a long conversation regarding Bilbo's ring, but Gandalf insists that the conversation should be paused until daylight. Gandalf asks Frodo to give him the ring. He holds it up to demonstrate that it has no markings upon its smooth surface. He then throws the ring into the fireplace, causing Frodo some alarm. He lets it sit in there for a few moments and pulls it out of the fire and hands it back to a startled Frodo. A glowing elven script gradually appears on the ring's surface. Gandalf explains that the letters form part of an ancient verse in the language of Mordor. Gandalf concludes that the ring is in fact the One Ring, belonging to the Dark Lord Sauron himself. Gandalf tells Frodo of the ring's history. Sauron made the ring in Mount Doom and used it to wage war on Middle-earth until Isildur cut the ring from Sauron's hand, destroying the Dark Lord's physical form. Isildur, however, refused to destroy the ring because of its power, and it eventually led him to his death in the River Anduin. The ring was lost for over 2,000 years until a hobbit, Degol, found it while fishing in the Anduin. His relative Smeagol was fishing with him and instantly ensnared by the ring. He murdered Degol, his relative, and took the ring himself and turned into the creature Gollum, who centuries later lost his precious to Bilbo in The Hobbit. Gollum was in search of Bilbo and the ring a few years later, but was captured by Sauron, who tortured him into revealing that Baggins from the Shire had the ring. Gandalf says that the ring must be destroyed by throwing it into the fires of Mount Doom. Frodo decides that he must leave the Shire and agrees with Gandalf that he will travel to Rivendell, the home of the Elven Lord Elrond, a leader, and Gandalf hears something and catches Frodo's gardener, Sam Gamgee, eavesdropping under the window. He tells Sam that as punishment he will have to go with Frodo on his journey. In late June of 3018, Gandalf suddenly announces that he is leaving immediately to go to look into something beyond the southern borders of the Shire, but refuses to specify what. He promises Frodo that he'll be back by the 22nd of September. However, by mid-September, there is no sign of him. Frodo decides that he has to leave Bag End and commence his journey. Fredegar Bolger, Folco Boffin, Peregrine Took, otherwise known as Pippin, and Meriadoc Brandybuck, otherwise known as Merry, help Frodo pack up his belongings, and on the 22nd of September, Frodo holds a small birthday party for them at Bag End. Frodo, Pippin and Sam leave for Buckland. On their journey, they come... Buckland, I should add, is a kind of outlying county of the Shire on the borders of the Old Forest. On their journey, they hear a horseman approaching. Frodo resolves to hide from sight, reasoning that if it happens to be Gandalf coming, they would surprise him. The three hobbits hide on the sides of the road, but for some reason Frodo feels an unexplained reluctance to do so. A large black horse appears on the road, ridden by a large man wrapped in black cloaks, his face shrouded in deep shadow under a black hood. The horse stops very near to Frodo, and the man appears to sniff the air, as if searching for a scent. Frodo is almost tempted to use the ring to disappear from sight, but before he can do so, the rider hurries his horse up along the road and disappears. Later that night, they meet a party of elves travelling through the Shire, led by the elf Gildor. They camp with Gildor. Frodo tells Gildor that Gandalf has missed the rendezvous and has not been seen for quite some time, asking Gildor for advice on how to proceed. Gildor becomes quite worried at this news, but tells Frodo that it's his decision whether to wait or to continue, and Frodo replies by saying, "Go not to the elves for counsel, for they will say both no and yes." This amuses Gildor, who relents and tells Frodo that he should probably continue on his way as soon as possible. He urges Frodo not to go on alone. He still refuses to explain to Frodo who the Black Rider was, but stresses the danger that they pose as servants of the enemy. So, in a shortcut to mushrooms, chapter 4, the hobbits cut across country and end up on Farmer Maggot's land, where Frodo had once tried to steal mushrooms. The farmer welcomes them from home for dinner, then takes them the rest of the way to the Buckleberry Ferry. And Farmer Maggot has also encountered the Black Riders, who are looking for Baggins from the Shire. After a tense but uneventful 5-mile journey, they reach the ferry and disembark. They suddenly hear hooves on the road and behind them, and the hobbits to prepare to face the Black Riders as Frodo hides in the wagon. Instead, the hooves turn out to be Merry Brandybuck, who has come down the road to look for his missing friends. A conspiracy unmasked. In this chapter, the 4 hobbits, that is Frodo, Sam, as you'll remember, the gardener who was eavesdropping on Frodo, Pippin and Merry reach Crickhollow, which is in Buckland, where Frodo reveals his intention to continue out of the Shire on his own. But the other hobbits reveal that Sam has been spying on their behalf and that they intend to come with him. Merry and Pippin will be coming with Frodo and Sam all the way to Rivendell, while Fatty Bolger remains behind to keep up appearances. Here they decide to go through the Old Forest to keep away from the Black Riders. So chapter 6, the Old Forest. The chapter begins with Merry, Sam and Pippin waking up in the early morning in Buckland. Together with Fatty Bolger, they prepare their ponies and they set off eastwards towards the edge of the Old Forest. They reach the impassable Buckland Hedge, which is a kind of barrier between the Old Forest and Buckland, where Merry reveals a hidden tunnel through the foliage that the Brandybucks sometimes use to enter the woods. They bid Fatty farewell. At the end of the tunnel, they pass through an iron gate, and Merry announces they have now left the Shire. He warns the others that the trees in the forest do not like strangers and might try to scare them away, especially during the night. They feel a sense of growing unease as they move through the forest, and I'll start to read a couple of extracts from the chapter now. So just from the middle of the page here, they picked away among the trees and their ponies plodded along, carefully avoiding the many writhing and interlacing roots. There was no undergrowth. No undergrowth growth. The ground was rising steadily, and as they went forward, it seemed that the trees became taller, darker, and thicker. There was no sound, except an occasional drip of moisture falling through the still leaves. For the moment, there was no whispering or movement among the branches, but they all got an uncomfortable feeling that they were being watched with disapproval, deepening to dislike and even enmity. The feeling steadily grew until they found themselves looking up quickly or glancing back over their shoulders as if they expected a sudden blow. The hobbits find themselves almost having to follow a valley, the valley of the Withywindle River. They can't seem to get out of the river, and it seems to be that there's only one way forward. Just a quick note on the post that I just included. This is from the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. Today we're featuring the rural landscape of Oxford. This watercolour is Water Lilies in the Sherwell by William Turner from 1851. It has been said that the Withywindle River from J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth, which featured in The Lord of the Rings, was inspired by this river. And I'm going to be talking a little bit more about some of the different things that inspired Tolkien in terms of including them in his book as we move on. So we'll continue on from where you can see the arrow. The hobbits began to feel very hot. There were armies of flies of all kinds buzzing around their ears, and the afternoon sun was burning their backs. At last they suddenly came into a thin shade. Great grey branches reached across the path. Each step forward became more reluctant than the last. Sleepiness seemed to be creeping out of the ground and up their legs, and falling softly out of the air upon their head and their eyes. Frodo felt his chin go down and his head nod. Just in front of him, Pippin fell forward on his knees. Frodo halted. "It's no good," he heard Merry saying. "Can't go another step without rest. Must have a nap. It'll be cool under the willows, less flies. Frodo did not like the sound of this. This is Pippin speaking, sorry. Come on, he cried. We can't have a nap yet. We must get clear of the forest first. But the others were too far gone to care. Beside them, Sam stood yawning and blinking stupidly. Suddenly, Frodo himself felt sleep overwhelming him. His head swam. There now seemed hardly a sound in the air. The flies had stopped buzzing. Only a gentle noise on the edge of hearing, a soft fluttering as a song half-whispered, seemed to stir in the boughs above. He lifted his heavy eyes and saw leaning over him a huge willow tree, old and hoary. Enormous it looked, its sprawling branches going up like reaching arms with many long-fingered hands, its knotted and twisted trunk gaping in the wide fissures that creaked faintly as the boughs moved. The leaves fluttering against the bright sky dazzled him as he toppled over, lying where he fell upon the grass. Merry and Pippin dragged themselves forward and lay down with their backs to the willow trunk. Behind them the great cracks gaped wide to receive them as the tree swayed and creaked. They looked up at the grey and yellow leaves moving softly against the light and singing. They shut their eyes, and then it seemed they could almost hear words, cool words, saying something about water and sleep. They gave themselves up to the spell and fell fast asleep at the foot of the great grey willow. Frodo lay for a while, fighting with the sleep that was overpowering him. Then, with an effort, he struggled to his feet again. He felt a compelling desire for cool water. "Wait for me, Sam," he stammered. "Must bathe feet for a minute." Half in a dream, he wandered forward to the riverwood side of the tree, with great winding roots growing out into the stream like gnarled dragonets straining down to drink. He straddled one of these and paddled his hot feet in the cool water. And there he suddenly fell asleep with his back against the tree. Sam sat down and scratched his head, yawning like a cavern. He was worried. The afternoon was getting late, and the thought of sleepiness uncanny. "There's more behind this than sun and warm air," he muttered to himself. "I don't like this big tree. I don't trust it. Hark to it singing and sleep now. This won't do at all." He pulled himself to his feet and staggered off to see what had become of the ponies. He found that two had wandered a good way along the path, and he had just caught them and brought them back towards the others when he heard two noises, one loud and the other soft but very clear. One was a splash of something heavy falling in the water. The other was noise like a snick of a lock when a door quietly closes fast. Sam rushes over and finds Frodo lying face down in the water underneath one of the willow's heavy roots. Sam struggles to pull him out. When Frodo is finally rescued, he says, "Do you know, Sam, the beastly tree threw me in. I felt it. The big roots just twisted round and tipped me in." Sam initially dismisses this as a dream, but to their horror, Sam and Frodo discover that the tree's roots have swallowed Pippin and half of Merry. Sam and Frodo kick and pull at the roots, but to no avail. Sam suggests lighting a fire, but Frodo is afraid of burning Merry and Pippin. They try to light the fire anyway, and they hear the sound of sinister far-off laughter. They start a small fire at the base of the tree, but then Merry screams from inside the roots, "Put it out, put it out! He'll squeeze me in two if you don't, he says so." Just as they are in despair, a strange figure appears on the path. A short bearded man dressed in colourful clothes and a feathered cap, carrying several white water lilies on top of a large leaf. Frodo begged for the man's help. The man introduces himself as Tom Bombadil, and he speaks in verses and sings. He calls the willow tree Old Man Willow and assures the hobbits that he knows how to deal with it. He starts to sing a song and strikes the tree with a stick. The tree releases their friends unharmed. Tom invites them to walk with him to his house to stay the night, which they do. There they meet Tom's wife, Goldberry. I talked a little bit about trees in my introduction to this channel, but there's a lot of writing about Tolkien in all sorts of forms, including a lot of academic papers. And I found one called Tolkien's Trees from the Malorn Journal, the Journal of the Tolkien Society, and this was written by C.R. Vinseth. So it talks about, hang on, I'll just flick over. It talks about Tolkien's trees and the mythology that is invested in them, and says that as a lover of trees and a man who abhorred the needless destruction of them, Tolkien the writer often defined his characters as good and evil by part of their feelings about trees. The writer goes on to talk about the Old Man Willow and how Tom Bombadil says that the tree has great cunning and a rotten heart. His power spread like fine root threads in the ground and invisible finger twigs in the air. Here, malice in the forest itself is personified by the Old Man Willow, and not an outside influence like Sauron. And so Tolkien, in a BBC interview, described how Old Man Willow is not related to Mordor, but a sort of a malignant presence in its own right. And Tolkien felt that there is sometimes a malice implicit in the cosmos, of which Sauron is only part, reminiscent of the cold and brutal world of Norse mythology. So I thought this was a very interesting perspective, which kind of describes some of the ways that some trees are seen as good, others as malignant or becoming malignant. And perhaps this links back to Tolkien's own view as a Catholic of a fallen world where you see both good and bad in nature. Anyway, food for thought. So, the hobbits find refuge and respite in the house of Tom Bombadil. And here we can see another of the many fine illustrations and paintings from the Lord of the Rings. And this is by Anne Eichmann in the house of Tom Bombadil. What happens in this chapter? The hobbits meet, eat supper and speak with Tom Bombadil and his wife Goldberry at their house. They sleep comfortably, though each hobbit except Sam has nightmares. The next day Tom speaks about Old Man Willow and then demonstrates that he is unaffected by the One Ring by holding it in his hand, and Frodo becomes quite annoyed about this. Tom teaches the hobbits a rhyme to summon his help, and then they go to sleep again. So that's it in a... Here, Tom Bombadil describes the old forest to the hobbits and how the forest had once been spread all across the world, and now how they were filled with the hatred of things that go free upon the earth, gnawing, biting, breaking, hacking, burning, destroyers and usurpers. I've just realised just now that line is actually used by Treebeard the Ent in the Two Towers in the film. But anyway, we'll see that later. Moving on. It was not called the Old Forest without reason, for it was indeed ancient, a survivor of vast forgotten woods, and in it there lived again, aging no quicker than the hills, the fathers of the fathers of trees, remembering times when they were lords. So this is interesting, the way Tolkien imbues this whole memory, history and mythology into the locations and the settings through which the hobbits are now travelling. Similarly, Tom Bombadil talks to them about the Barrow Downs, which are near his house. He talks about how there were fortresses in the old days on the heights. Kings of little kingdoms fought together, and the young sun shone like fire on the red metal of their new and greedy swords. There was victory and defeat. Towers fell, fortresses were burned, flames went up into the sky, gold was piled on the biers of the dead kings and queens, and mounds covered them, and the stone doors were shut, and the grass grew over all. Sheep walked for a while biting in the grass, but soon the hills were empty again. A shadow came out of the dark places far away, and the bones were stirred in the mounds. Barrow wights walked in the hollow places with the clink of rings on cold fingers and gold chains in the wind. The hobbits shuddered. Even in the Shire, the rumour of the Barrow Downs had beyond the forest had been heard, but it was not a tale that any hobbit liked to listen to, even by a comfortable fireside far away. At this point, we should ask, who is Tom Bombadil, and indeed his wife Goldberry? So Tom Bombadil is a character who Tolkien had already invented, belonging perhaps to a fairy world, and Goldberry similarly has many of those characteristics, has been ethereal and timeless. Tolkien stated that he invented Tom Bombadil in memory of his children's Dutch doll. His Bombadil poems far predated the writing of The Lord of the Rings, into which Tolkien introduced Tom Bombadil from the earliest drafts. Tolkien commented that in a mythical age there must be some enigmas, that is, some mysteries or something that's a little bit, out of the ordinary, as there always is or are. Tom Bombadil is one. Bombadil has a power over his own domain, and the Ring of Power is not effective. But otherwise, he is almost like separated from the world, like a hermit, you might say. To demonstrate this, at one stage, Tom Bombadil asks Frodo that whether he can hold the ring, and I think from memory put it on. It has no effect on Tom Bombadil, and he just laughs and hands it back to Frodo. Frodo is already beginning to become very possessive of the ring and is somewhat annoyed by Tom Bombadil's sort of frivolous attitude towards the ring. So they say farewell to Tom Bombadil, and he provides them with supplies, and they repack their ponies, who fortunately are still with them. And Tom Bombadil gives them some warnings about the Barrow Downs, that they should just travel during sunlight and just stick to a direct sort of path until they reach the main road again that will lead them into the town of Bree. So they set out. Under the warmth of the midday sun, with full stomachs after a break, the hobbits fall asleep. When they awake, they are horrified to discover that the sun is already setting and the area has become covered in a thick fog, seemingly centred on the standing stone where they had slept. They scrambled to their ponies and set off northwards, hoping to get towards the trees along the roadside they had seen earlier, but the mist becomes colder and damper as they proceed, and darkness falls. They fall into a trance-like state. Frodo awakes to find himself on a stone slab inside a barrow. He realises that he has been captured by a ghoul, a Barrow Wight, held motionless by its evil spell. He thinks about Bilbo and the adventures they'd had together, and begins to wonder if this was the grim end to his adventure here and now. This thought gives him courage, and helps him ward off the white spell, allowing him to move a little. He notices an eerie glow emanating around him. He turns over and sees Sam, Merry and Pippin lying on the stone slabs beside him, motionless and pale-like. The freshly deceased dressed in white robes, wearing golden crowns with treasures strewn around them. A single long sword lies across their necks. Frodo begins to hear a murmuring song. When he awakes, and then he decides to sing the song that Tom Bombadil has taught them. He sings a song, and Tom Bombadil arrives and rescues them once again. He retrieves their ponies and sets them on their way towards the road. A possible inspiration of this place for Tolkien was the Barrow Downs of Warwickshire, near the village of Long Compton. The concept of burial mound housing evil spirits was actually fairly new and created by Tolkien, but there were some hints. The Barrow Wights resemble a creature in Germanic mythology known in Norse as a Dragor. I sometimes add a few short videos into my talks, and this is one by John Garth talking about the worlds of J.R.R. Tolkien. It's just a minute or two long.
He used whatever was convenient to him. He used the scenery around Oxford, the barrows, the standing stones in the hills around Oxford and things like that. He used, I believe, memories, scenes from walks he had been on to.
So I've already run to 39 minutes. So I'm actually going to stop because I've realised that to divide the Fellowship of the Ring into 3, I need to stop now. We're up to the end of chapter 7 of book 1. We then finish chapters 8 to 12 of book 1. Then we will do chapters 1 to 4 of book 2. That's next week. And then in the third and final installment for the Fellowship of the Rings, we will do the remaining chapters of book 2. So